So thanks very much for everyone for being here. This will be a tight hour, and we've already heard in our prelude Revolution 9 and indeed Revolution. And we'll be looking at the year 1968 through the lens of the Beatles and the White Album, and at those select songs of the White Album through the context of the Beatles. The 60s, as you all know, was a very, very turbulent decade. Philip Larkin from Annus Mirabilis tells us, in terms of his view of the most pertinent year of the 60s, sexual intercourse began in 1963 between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Christopher Bray says in a book that came out a couple of years ago that 1965 was the year that modern Britain really began. Just this week we've had John Savage coming out with a book saying the centre of pop really started to explode in 1966. Take your pick. But for this evening we're looking at 1968. Bliss was at that dawn, to be alive, but to be young was very heaven, said Wordsworth, not in 1968, but around 1789. And the connection is that to be young and to be revolutionary was almost synonymous for many people across London, Paris, Rome, Berlin, chanting London, Paris, Rome, Berlin, we shall fight and we shall win. What they were fighting about we shall explore in the social context of the 60s. But in typical fashion, in the 60s style, and I ask for your generosity on this, we are going to begin at the end. But before we do that, we're just going to look at a few critical lenses. If this thing works, yes it does. Because we could look in terms of critical approaches at the 60s as a failed decade. And that song Revolution we've just heard, since the Beatles don't own their own songs, was last heard en masse really as part of a Nike advert. And if the ideals of the 60s were ever confirmed as dead, I guess it is through such commercialism. As Aaron Copland tells us, if you want to know about the 60s, listen to the music of the Beatles. We could examine the White Album, the double album that the Beatles produced in terms of postmodernity. It's fragmented, it's produced from a very fractured group at that time. It's full of parody and satire. It's full of innocence and experience. Childlike songs, nursery rhyme-like songs that have a darkness to them. We could look at Schechner and performance theory, and towards the end of this hour we'll perhaps be looking at John Lennon, whose life became very much a performance. But we're going to take a pretty much standard historicist take on the 60s, on the text of the White Album and the context of 1968. We could take a personal viewpoint. This is Mr. Goran Stefanovsky's Beatles membership card. I believe, Goran, from 1968. And of course, when we're looking at history, well, whose viewpoint do we take? And I have found most fascinating in researching this, not only the texts about the 60s that are on display, as well as texts from the 60s, you're more than welcome to peruse afterwards, but actually interviewing people like Goran who were there at the time. But anyway, let's begin at the end. This is a famous picture, Earthrise, and it is taken by one of the Apollo 8 astronauts, which was the first manned voyage to the moon, taken by William Anders with his Hasselblad. This photograph probably is the most historically important photograph from the 60s because it's the first time that humankind is looking back at the Earth in the orbit of another celestial body. Most of you, I suspect, will know Apollo 11 and the story of the July 1969 moon landings. The forgotten Apollo, I guess, is Apollo 8, which came about coincidentally during Christmas of 1968, at the end of that year. Why was Apollo 8 important? Because it was orbiting the moon in preparation for the landings. NASA was terrified in its Cold War mentality of the Russians beating them to the moon. They were ready with their giant Saturn V rocket. This is a smaller version of that Saturn V rocket, the largest, tallest construction of any rocket ever built. That would get them to the moon, but what they weren't ready with was the lunar lander itself. So they switched missions and said, what can we do that's going to be spectacular? Let's get our guys round the moon. And so they did. And somewhat controversially, as it turned out, on Christmas Eve, mankind first travelled round another celestial body, and the astronauts of Apollo 8 all read from Genesis. It was controversial because subsequently NASA was sued by secular societies in America. And when the landing actually took place with Apollo 11 the next year in July, Buzz Aldrin, much to the surprise of Neil Armstrong himself, produced a small chalice, produced a small wafer, and actually took communion on the moon, the first act actually on that landing. No one knew about it at the time because of the furore surrounding this small broadcast. And we'll hear from Commander Frank Borman towards the end of the broadcast.
The morning was the second day. God said, let the waters under heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
So for many, Apollo 8 redeemed the turbulence of 1968. And I imagine in this poem, Frank Borman looking back at the Earth and looking back at that year, full of tragedy, protest, Vietnam, the My Lai massacres. And this is what I imagine Frank Borman had to say. American Magi, we travel 240,000 miles. Trust stars we squint to see, light first born above Columbus. From millions they chose 3 of us, unshaven, cramped as convicts, bullet aimed towards sky's heart. For every star and its persistence, another shriveled baby burns. My Lai smoulders in its silence. The soldiers find in nothing shiver in their sleep, edge in dream up Main Street towards our children's bed. Frank and Bill beside me sleep through Capcom's static, their weightless arms above them raise the desert sky, breathing in day's night like fragile twins in incubation. We're first to cut the dark side, swim moon sky's soundless tide. I'm sickening in the cold until Earth comes round again. Blue crescent, silent womb. Frank Borman was embarrassed because as a naval commander, he was constantly sick and throwing up going to the moon. But the mission was held it as a great success, and of course Wade lay for the landing the next year. But what was the Earth like that he was looking back on? Well, cinema-wise, reflected the development of consciousness that was coming with the space race, and not least in Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Racial tensions were reflected in sci-fi too, with the original Planet of the Apes. More overtly, last year's In the Heat of the Night received Best Oscar at the Oscar ceremonies with the great Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger. And back home, Lindsay Anderson was producing his masterpiece, If, a wonderful metaphor for the revolutions or revolutionary zeal to come as public school boys wage armed warfare against their staff. So, this is an era of great altered states. If 67 was all about raising consciousness through LSD, 68 perhaps was a politicization of such altered states. And I guess if we have a thesis tonight, it is arguing that the White Album reflects the fragmentation of 1968 in the same way that Sgt. Pepper, it is generally agreed, reflects the Summer of Love in 1967. So, London, Paris, Rome, Berlin, we shall fight and we shall win. Who was fighting and what were they fighting about? Basically, the gravitational pull, the black hole that was bringing all these disparate groups together was Vietnam and protests about the Vietnam War. In London, Tariq Ali was leading student protests, and Grosvenor Square outside the American Embassy became a general battlefield. But the real action was in France. Danny the Red, a Dutchman, was linking up with trade unions and the anti-Vietnam protest became a genuinely revolutionary protest to bring down the government. The National Assembly was closed, the Sorbonne was closed, and de Gaulle banned demos and new elections were held. And rather like in America, the right reacts to the radical left and de Gaulle wins by a landslide. In Berlin, Red Rudy is shot at. You have Basque separatists kicking off in Spain. You have similar events going on in Athens against the generals. And even further afield, wider in Europe, you have in Iraq a socialist revolution with the Ba'ath Party, which of course is going to lead to the rise of Saddam Hussein, which is of course going to lead to the complications we're still living with today, shadowed by incursions into Vietnam. So this era continues to have resonance for all our politicians and ourselves, Congo, Mexico too. But it's not a simple question of the reactionary right and the radical left, because in Eastern Europe, with the communist governments, you have the Prague Spring, and you have Alexander Dubček attempting a kind of early perestroika, socialism with a human face, he called it, before protests led to the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union closing things down as the tanks came. And separate from that, and perhaps in a pocket of its own, but part of the general turbulence, you have the beginning of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And the Cultural Revolution in China continues, where basically it began in '66, and basically you have an entrenched attack on the bourgeoisie, on the middle classes, from Chairman Mao. So, Vietnam really is the focus of most of those protests. And Vietnam is really kicking off, and Americans are starting to visibly lose. You have the Tet Offensive, the New Year's Day, the New Year offensive from the Viet Cong, supported by the North Vietnamese Army. And on American television screens, the American embassy in Saigon is besieged. Oh, welcome, warm welcome. Walter Cronkite, quite a conservative TV presenter, America's own David Dimbleby, Richard Dimbleby type figure, said this in a special report after the attack on the embassy. It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate not as victors but as honourable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. South Vietnam was hardly a democracy, but as LBJ later commented, once you lose Cronkite, you lose America. We know now, through tapes in the White House, that Lyndon Johnson was saying there was light at the end of the tunnel, the war was winnable, while feeling from the earliest days this was a quagmire America could not possibly succeed in. Khe Sanh and the My Lai massacre, where Americans are accused and convicted of war crimes, further shames and further taints the domestic scene. And so you have a very interesting general presidential election that year in America. You have anti-war candidates. You have Bobby Kennedy late joining the race, and he comes out against the war too. And he really is the youth person's vote, if you like. You have the notion on the left of the yippies, politicised hippies, really, around Jerry Rubin and A.B. Hoffman forming. And you have the universities of America really leading up to the kind of riotous situation that's going to end in tragedy with the Kent State massacres a year later. What does Bobby Kennedy say? This nation must adopt a foreign policy which says clearly and distinctly, no more Vietnams. So he really joins and overtakes Eugene McCarthy as the anti-Vietnam candidate. Hiya, Tom. Here's the real expert coming in. Lyndon Johnson is broken by the war. He does not wish to stand as his party's candidate. And Martin Luther King, who's been vociferously against the war since '65, continues to argue against involvement. So you've got a fractured America. And that fracture is mirrored domestically with the civil rights campaign continuing despite LBJ's legislation. It ends in tragedy with Martin Luther King's assassination and riots in Watts, LA, in Chicago and Detroit, and in Washington. It seems like America is falling apart. That sense of absolute doom is reinforced with the death, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, when it looks like he's going to go on to really challenge, if not win, the Democratic nomination. So what looked like a repeat of 60, a Kennedy versus Nixon, actually turns into something else. Hubert Humphrey, the establishment choice, the vice president, gets the nomination for the Democrats, but it's really all over for them before the election because of Chicago 68, whereby the yippies, student protesters, radicals seek to persuade the Democratic Party to take a more left-wing turn, and a complete overreaction by Mayor Daley, to the extent that televised live, you have journalists on the floor of the Democratic Convention being manhandled and hustled. You have police quite deliberately going out and beating up student protesters. As Cronkite again says, the Democratic Convention is about to begin in a police state. The civil rights movement cannot be held as non-violent anymore. The death of Martin Luther King obviously has a trigger effect, and very significantly, when we come to this picture, in the Mexico Olympics of that year, you have Tommie Smith and John Carlos giving the Black Power salute. So it looks like the divisions that were bubbling under from the early 60s are now exploding. And in the midst of all that, President Nixon is elected, ironically. And for many people, the 60s doesn't really end until 73, 74, Nixon's resignation over Watergate, if we talk about the long 60s, I guess. So that fragmentation in America is not exactly mirrored in England, and you could argue there's more liberal legislation going on in England, even than in LBJ's Great Society. In 68, you have Race Relations Act. You have homosexuality legalised in 67, abortion legalised in 68, equal pay legislation, and even, astonishingly, the theatres are still under censorship until 68, leading to full frontal nudity and shows like Hair. You have on television Nigel Neal's The Year of the Sex Olympics TV drama, where sex is turned into a competition. Apparently the Russians are tested for drugs and Britain comes 14th, but that's another matter. You have technological breakthroughs too. And Roy Jenkins, I would argue, is a more radical figure than Tariq Ali, because Roy Jenkins, as Home Secretary, he becomes Chancellor too, he becomes Foreign Secretary, and of course he later forms the SDP, coming back from the European Commission, says this: "Let us be on the side of those who want people to be free to live their own lives, to make their own mistakes, and to decide in an adult way, and provided they do not infringe the rights of others, the code by which they wish to live." So much of the freedoms that we take for granted today are there really down to Roy Jenkins, not just as Home Secretary, but the general influence that Roy had. He called it the civilised society. Others came somewhat dismissively to call it the permissive society. Amongst those who attacked the 60s, and there's Roy Jenkins, are the likes of Peter Hitchens. And in his book, The Abolition of Britain, he says, Jenkins devised a programme which had more effect on the way that life is lived in this country than the thoughts of any other post-war politician, including Margaret Thatcher. Now, we can debate that. But whether you are feeling we should be very, very grateful for what the 60s liberalisations did, or you actually look back and think that's where it all started to go wrong, Roy Jenkins was a pivotal figure. But another pivotal figure, of course, was Enoch Powell, with his famous Rivers of Blood speech. And some of the tone, if you like, if not the substance of what Enoch Powell was saying is unfortunately still with us today. So, seminal years. What were the Beatles therefore doing during all of this? Well, not a lot, because they had gone to India. they were seeking, like everybody else who was young in the 60s, an expansion of consciousness. They'd done that undoubtedly through LSD and prior to that through cannabis, but they were now starting to disavow drugs, at least temporarily, having hooked up with the Maharishi. Paul, I think by 1968 we're all a bit exhausted spiritually. There was a feeling of, yeah, well, it's great to be famous, it's great to be rich, but what's it all for? John, if we'd met Maharishi before we'd taken LSD, we wouldn't have needed to take it. So they fly off, John and George fly off to India. George and Paul don't last very long. Ringo takes his own food and comes back saying, it's just like Botlin's. Paul lasts a bit longer, but it's basically George and John. They become disillusioned because the rumour goes round, which George has said is since a load of rubbish, that the Maharishi was showing a little too much interest in some of the younger disciples. And John very typically says this, I said, we're leaving, to the Maharishi. Why, he asked, and all that shit. And I said, well, if you're so cosmic, you'll know why. So, why is India important? It's important musically, quite apart from the spiritual progressions that the Beatles are trying to make, because all they've got there are acoustic albums. They haven't got a lot to do there apart from meditate and go to the Maharishi's classes. And so they start to write lots of songs, and it just pours out of them. Half the White Album songs were written in India, and they were written acoustically. This was new for the Beatles. For the most part, over the past couple of years, the Beatles had come, John and Paul predominantly, had come to the studio with half-formed songs, finished them off in the studio. And they were more genuine collaborations in the early years, admittedly, but they were helping each other out. Now you had two things. One, you had fully formed songs, and when they got back from India, they all demoed these at George's house in Isha. And secondly, they were writing fully separately. That Indian influence is nevertheless there very overtly as well as implicitly. John writes across the universe in India. And although it's not released, he doesn't know what to do with it. In the end, he gives it to Spike Milligan for a charity wildlife album, and it eventually appears heavily orchestrated on Let It Be. But it kind of combines the outer explorations of going to the moon across the universe with the inner explorations that even drugs didn't seem to satisfy. George is more overtly into Indian music. He's introduced the sitar on Norwegian wood in '65. He writes The Inner Light, which is based on a Tao Te Ching extract, which is sent to him as the second of his Indian attempts, or rather the third after Without You. And the Beatles themselves, like every other young person at the time, are questioning for identity and questioning for meaning. But this isn't out of sorts with what's going on in pop and rock generally. Dylan has retreated. He does not want to be the spokesperson of a generation. He's burnt out in '66. There may or may not have been a serious accident. And he records what's now known and has been released as the Basement Tapes with the band. But the Byrds, Donovan and the like are all very much into a return to the country. It almost becomes a rock cliche. Whereas that's in contrast to the urban blues of Cream, Fleetwood Mac, Chicken Shack and the rock of Joplin, Hendrix and Who. So you see the Beatles actually, almost accidentally, being part and parcel of a more rural, idyllic kind of music. George really here starts to be a surrogate guru throughout his career. And Ravi Shankar, who George befriends, says he was so astonished that someone so young was so at ease and at home with everything Indian, it convinced him of the reality of reincarnation, which is a thought. Okay. So, when the Beatles get back, they try what they call a bit of Western communism. They set up Apple and they advertise as producers for people to send in their tapes, and people send in millions of tapes, and Apple loses money left, right and centre. There's more money going out than even the Beatles are earning. And there's a great sketch in Eric Idle's The Ruttles, which is his Monty Python take on the Beatles, featuring George as a heavily made up interviewer, interviewing Eric Manchester, who's Michael Palin playing Derek Taylor, the Beatles press officer, saying there's no pilfering going on at Apple whatsoever, while behind them we can see the office furniture, the photocopies and all the rest of it being taken out of the building. Meanwhile, John is getting very much into performance art, and this is obviously the influence of Yoko. He's met Yoko a couple of years earlier, but they are now together, and he produces, as we'll see later on, an experimental album, Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins. He records Revolution 1 and Revolution 9. They exhibit at the Robert Fraser Gallery. They start doing their peacenik kind of artistic escapades, sending acorns for peace to all the world leaders and planting acorns outside Coventry Cathedral. John's musings from 1964 and 65 are adapted by Victor Spinetti for the national stage. And Apple itself, although a commercial disaster, is very interesting musically, because you have a whole range of artists who do get launched by Apple, including the house band Badfinger, James Taylor, who's still with us, Billy Preston, and then more interesting people. The Modern Jazz Quartet is taken up by McCartney, Radha Krishna Temple by George Harrison, and indeed John Tavener gets his first record release through Apple. So they're even getting into classical stuff. Meanwhile, Yellow Submarine is produced too. Yellow Submarine is behind the times because it's an animated feature based on Sgt. Pepper and based on The Summer of Love. But nevertheless, the Beatles initially, indifferent to it, then see how pop-arty it is, and they appear at the end. And it does portray and fits in with the notion of 1968 being a battle between the blue meanies and the hippies, because that's exactly how Pepperland is illustrated. So the Beatles eventually come on board with Yellow Submarine. Though it does seem to be more a reflection of The Summer of Love than the traumas to come. So they produce A Doll's House. And of course, A Doll's House is the album no one's ever heard of, because that was the initial name for what became known as the Beatles, the White Album. But they wanted to call it initially A Doll's House until another band came up with a similar name. And this was going to be the cover for A Doll's House, and this has since been used for a compilation later on. And what we get instead is Richard Hamilton's stark design for the Beatles, the double album. A deliberate attempt to get away from the persona of Sgt. Pepper, to get away from the psychedelia that album portrayed. And inside, as we've got illustrated here, you have a pop art collage by Richard Hamilton, who was sort of an established pop artist at the time, and indeed there's McCartney in Richard Hamilton's studio as that collage is put together, the Beatles contributing personal photographs and memorabilia for that particular piece of work. So the White Album is presented almost as a work of art. Sgt. Pepper has been the first album really taken up by the cognoscenti and treated in reviews as a work of art, and the White Album, individually numbered with its stark cover, is very much considered an artefact for young people, but not the teenagers the Beatles were appealing to just a couple of years earlier. Why? Because they'd grown up. And in their stead comes the Monkees to appeal to the new teenagers. So, the reviews. Ian MacDonald, who really is an established authority, was an established authority on the Beatles, said, A Doll's House would have been an apt title for a musical attic of odds and ends, some charming, others sinister, many tinged with childhood memories. There is a secret unease in this music. Certainly no other product of the noon-bright idiom of the 60s pop offers as many associations of guarded privacy and locked rooms, or concludes in such disturbing, dreamlike darkness. The Times said at the time, William Mann, no other living composer has achieved so much this year. This was the kind of status the Beatles now occupied in mainstream music, pop or otherwise. The Observer, Tony Palmer, film director's famous review. Almost every track is a send-up of a send-up of a send-up, rollicking, reckless, gentle, magical. The Beyer tapestry of popular music, a prolific outpouring of melody, music-making of unmistakable clarity and foot-tapping beauty. The sarcasm and bitterness that have always given their music its unease and edginess still bubbles. And there is an unease to many of the tracks. It was nevertheless, for all its challenges, if you like, Capitol's best-selling album at the time in America. And as far as Paul dealing with the criticism that they should have had a single album rather than a double album, quite rightly he says, it's the Beatles' White Album, shut up. So what do we have on the White Album? Well, if you're here, you probably know. But we have rock, we have blues, we have ska, we have country and western, folk, ballads, avant-garde, you name it, it's there. And I've tried to, in a typically academic way, categorise these. Perhaps this would be a party game to see where you'd put these songs. But there are haunting nursery songs like Dear Prudence, Saturday Morning Pictures of Bungalow Bill, Rocky Raccoon, Cry Baby Cry, and even Good Night at the End, which is a lush ballad not written by McCartney, but written by Lennon for Julian, his son. So, but all of those songs, and I'd say especially the likes of Dear Prudence, do have, like the best fairy tales, a dark edge to them. You have the parodies and satires back in the USSR is a direct response to the Beach Boys, and the Beatles have been in friendly rivalry. Pet Sounds was a response allegedly to Rubber Soul, which led to Revolver and so forth. Or at least the Beach Boys meets Chuck Berry. Obladi Oblada was a deliberate attempt at reggae and became a #1 for one-hit wonders Marmalade. Why Don't We Do It in the Road, I guess, was the sexual explicitness that era was asking for. You've got, even when you've got a number like Ringo, who'd had a song called Don't Pass Me By, trying to get on Beatles albums for years. We don't know if this is the same song, but I'm still not sure if it's Ringo just being Ringo or a deliberate parody of a country and western song done by Ringo. So I've put it in that category. And you have the blues of Yer Blues, and then songs, obviously, that are parodies like Honey Pie, whereby Paul's doing good time 20s stuff. And I suppose Piggies too is sort of George taking on a protest angle. You have the overtly surrealist Happiness is a Warm Gun, which is a three-part song really, and the one where the Beatles are really playing together. For most of these, they're in separate studios. They're helping each other out. So the fragmentation is not just a question of content, but a question of process and form as well. Revolution 9 we'll come on to. You have what might be called exercises in style, with the Beatles parodying themselves with the likes of Glass Onion, and trying to write the most raucous rock song ever in Helter Skelter. You have straightforward ballads. The beautiful Long, Long, Long from George is a love song to God. And you have those finger-picking folk songs, pure as they were written in India, Mother Nature's Son and Blackbird. And even Child of Nature, which never got on the album, but was later reworked by Lennon as Jealous Guy. So it's a wonderful range of songs, even if some people feel side 3 perhaps doesn't measure up to the high standards of the Beatles. But we're now going to hear one of those songs, Blackbird, and we'll talk about it after Mark has dutifully played it. Thanks, Mark.
Oh, that's it. Can I just...
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Beautiful. That's brilliantly done. I was at a Paul McCartney concert recently, and he asked the audience, and this is the O2, you know, who here has attempted to play blackboard when they've learnt a guitar? And practically everyone puts up their hand. Who here has played it correctly? And everyone puts down their hand. The songs on the White Album, and not least Blackbird, are incredibly hard to play, unlike most Beatles songs, because they're actually experimenting with chords with their acoustic guitars out in India. Okay, what are the origins of that tune? Well, some say it was a bird Paul heard in India and he finished the song in Scotland. Others say it was only completed fully when demoed in Isha. Some say it was for Paul's Paulie step-grandmother. But as far as Paul's concerned, he acknowledges there was a classical influence with Bach. Paul was the radical artistic Beatle before John really met Yoko, because he had the time to go around the galleries and experiment, and he was very much into classical music in '68. And of course there's always the influence of Donovan. My brother went to a Donovan concert recently. Apparently Donovan's responsible for the entire oeuvre of the Western Hemisphere. Donovan does seem to have a thing about being influencing everyone. God bless him. But there is a folk element very obvious in a song like Blackbird, which was not obvious in any previous Beatles songs until the influence of Dylan. It's recorded alone in Studio 3 at Abbey Road in 6 hours only. So this is one of those obviously solo ventures. Some people say it was even influenced by a 1960 musical to Blackbird. But what does Paul say? He says in part it is a reflection on the death of Martin Luther King, and it is a paean to the civil rights movement. And that's certainly how it is read today. But it's a prime example of what the White Album is about. Basically, Beatles working alone. Beatles reflecting, not speaking for, but reflecting very much the times in which they live, and like all good art, open to a million metaphors in many ways. But it certainly shows an overt folk and rural influence that we haven't heard in Beatle music before. If we take one of Paul's, well, let's take one of John's, and we come to Revolution, which is a more direct dialogue, I guess, with the times. You say you want a revolution, well, you know we all want to change the world. You tell me that it's evolution, well, you know we all want to change the world, but when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out in? There are three versions of Revolution. The first version we're going to hear in a few minutes again from Mark, and it's a slow doo-wop version. Lennon very much wanted it as the new Beatles single. In the end, McCartney comes up with Hey Jude, and there's kind of no competition, but Revolution is speeded up and becomes the B-side version that we heard just before this talk. But Lennon's having a dialogue with himself about whether he wants to become politically engaged or not. What was the response from the radical left? A lamentable petty bourgeois cry of fear. Poor John. This was very interesting, a letter from a Keele University student at the time. That record was no more revolutionary than Mrs. Dale's diary. In order to change the world, we've got to understand what's wrong with the world and then destroy it ruthlessly. This is not cruelty or madness. It is one of the most passionate forms of love, because what we're fighting is suffering, oppression, humiliation, the immense toll of unhappiness caused by capitalism. And any love which does not pit itself against these things is sloppy and irrelevant. There is no such thing as a polite revolution. Well, I guess you can change the politics, but the tone is sadly familiar. This was John's response. I don't remember saying that revolution was revolutionary. Fuck Mrs. Dale. Listen to all three versions of revolution. You're obviously on a destruction kick. I'll tell you what's wrong with it, the world, people. So, do you want to destroy them? Ruthlessly, until we change our heads. There's no chance. Tell me one successful revolution. Who fucked up communism, Christianity, capitalism, Buddhism, etc.? Sick heads and nothing else. Do you think all the enemy wear capitalist badges so that you can shoot them? It's a bit naive, John. You seem to think it's just a class war. So even when Lennon was trying to be radical, I guess he wasn't being radical enough. Pardon my French there. He is going to change. He will come 1972, be heavily on the left. But for now, Revolution is an ambiguous song about being in or being out, joining or not. But at the time, and from '68 really to the end of his Beatle life, John is very much pushing a pacifist, peaceful alternative to the mainstream. But now we're going to hear Revolution 1 from Mark.
Do join in if you know the word. Or people in the cheap seats just You say you want a revolution. Well, you know, we all want to change the world. You tell me that it's evolution. Well, you know, we all want to change the world. But when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out in? Don't you know it's gonna be alright? You know it's gonna be alright. You know it's gonna be alright. You say you got a real solution. Well, you know, we'd all love to see the plan. You ask me for a contribution. Well, you know, we're all doing what we can. But if you want money for people with minds I'd hate, all I can tell you is, brother, you'll have to wait. You know it's gonna be alright. You know it's gonna be alright. You know it's gonna be alright.
Hey! I'm indebted to Mark for enlivening this lecture, and one song he should be singing his birthday, because it's actually his daughter's theatre birthday trip, and so Mark isn't going to be walking out, but he does have to leave early. Okay, but thank you, Mark. All right. What about Revolution 9 then, that third Revolution record? Well, if you were here before the lecture, we were having it in the background, and it's something quite astonishing, whether we love it or hate it. It's probably, this album sold in its millions, and it's probably the most popular avant-garde song ever, if we can call it a song, ever released, and probably the track that is least listened to of all the Beatles tracks. It began as a coda to that song, an improv, for going on for 20 minutes. The Beatles were working on 4-track and then 8-track at Abbey Road. Abbey Road was not a greatly sophisticated studio for the times, and they were actually cutting up tapes, putting them together, and we'll see the content of those tapes in a minute, but having to have spools of tape going round the studio held up by pencils. It was very much a Heath Robinson job compared to the digital world today. The cut-up text of Burroughs, the collages of Hamilton, of Richard Hamilton, the musique concrete experiments of Cage and Stockhausen were all influences on Lennon, or rather influences on Yoko Ono, who was then influencing Lennon. She was part of Fluxus, the Flow, and situationist groups who were basically holding happenings, who were saying art doesn't have to be stratified, it doesn't have to be even particularly pre-crafted, it needs to be spontaneous. This was the spirit of the 60s, because if the one word that really resonated for the avant-garde in the 60s, which linked with those political movements, it was randomness. Things were better if they happened randomly. Things were better if we weren't too tightly controlling about them. So the kind of tensions that the post-structuralists are talking about coming out of Paris, deconstructing language, deconstructing power, the kind of tensions that were going on in the streets were exactly echoed in the avant-garde by these people saying, and Lennon himself saying, why should we be limited to a 3-minute pop song? Why do we need verse, chorus? Why do we need melody? We see that experiments starting earlier in '66 with something like Tomorrow Never Knows, which, for all its drug influence and for all its Eastern influence, is also interesting musically because it's based around one chord. And this really, Revolution 9, being non-melodic at all, could be seen as an extension of that. So what's on Revolution 9? We hope Goran will be doing the world's first live version of this in a couple of weeks. But you've got a choir. Lennon is cutting up tapes and sticking them back together at random. You've got backwards violins. The Beatles were experimenting with backwards tapes from Rain, the B-side of Paperback Writer, from 1966. You've got Sibelius' 7th Symphony in there, backwards, and some Beethoven as well. There are orchestral overdubs from the Beatles' own A Day in the Life of the previous year. There are glasses being banged, there's applause, there's some opera, a backwards mellotron, some humming, spoken phrases by George and John, the dance craze list, the Watusi and so forth. They are just spouting randomly. There's a cassette of John and Yoko screaming right. There are library tapes from the Royal Academy Music Exam, and there are cut-ups of people on the street. It's interesting, some people say that the number 9, that is the only thing that holds it together, repeated fading in and out, comes from a bingo call, but it's pretty certain it comes from a Royal Academy music exam. So even there, the notion of an exam tape being cut up and recontextualized is both sort of postmodern, but I think more than that, is actually quite revolutionary given the context. This is a mainstream pop album, for goodness sake. The other 3 Beatles and George Martin fought to keep this track off the album. Please, John, no. John insisted. And I think today, I hate to say this, but I think he was right because it remains a fantastic soundscape of the spirit of '68, if nothing else. Lennon said later, "I thought I was painting in sound a picture of revolution, but I made a mistake. The mistake was that it was anti-revolution." In '68, revolution appeared less a call to arms than a revolution in the head, to use MacDonald's phrase, based on the conceptual art of Yoko Ono. In other words, that notion that we need to change consciousness, not just political structures, is kind of there in Yoko Ono's art and therefore translates into Lennon's Revolution 9. It's a channel-hopping interlude between sleep and waking to stir the abiding concerns of the '60s counterculture quality of awareness, says MacDonald. In other words, we're listening to a mainstream pop album and then all of a sudden we get this. We might switch off, but it's the Beatles, so we're going to stay listening. And in a way, just its place on that album, throwing us out of complacency, making us see how structured, how artificial a pop song can be, is in itself quite revolutionary. "Do not adjust your brain, there's a fault in reality" was one hippie slogan that certainly fits here. It took 2 days to compile and record, and it was preceded, however, by McCartney's still unreleased 1967 Carnival of Light. McCartney had been cutting up films, McCartney had been cutting up tapes beforehand. He's still quite peeved. He's not seen as the radical arty Beatle, I think, in interviews. But he was doing this stuff while Lennon was getting fat in Weybridge with a marriage that had clearly reached its end. McCartney was out and about in the galleries and the alternative theatres of London. And Carnival of Light was going to be released on Anthology. It was part of a happening at the Roundhouse, but it was vetoed by the other Beatles. However, interestingly and thankfully, Revolution 9 is not evoked by Charles Manson, because one of the direct influences, unbeknown to the Beatles, of the White Album were the Manson murders in 1969. This is where the 60s really goes wrong. We have Altamont and we have the Manson family. And Manson, in his psychotic, drug-crazed state, listened to the White Album and thought this was the whole thing was a call for revolution, and that he would murder Sharon Tate and the like, blame it on Black America, and Black America would rise up and there would be a revolution. This was the insane thinking of Charlie Manson. And Manson evokes Helter Skelter as that call to revolution. He evokes George's Piggies, but he doesn't evoke Revolution 9 as a revolutionary song. Frankly, it's inappropriate to really to look on a mass murderer as with any sort of critical credence. But all I'm saying is the darkness and the turn of the 60s and the influence of the Beatles was there even in psychotic states such as Charlie Manson. And indeed, the film of the Manson murders is called Helter Skelter, after that perversity, that perverse reading of the White Album. So, what does Lennon go on to do? Well, really, he goes on in Schechnerian terms to turn his life into a performance. Schechner, put very, very simply, thinks that everything is a performance. It's not particularly a new or novel thought. All the world's a stage, the men and women merely players, is what he's echoing. But Lennon decides that given the fact he can't have a private life, given the fact that even though they've stopped touring, the Beatles are in constant focus, he will use that performance, the performance of being a Beatle, to effect a peace campaign with Yoko. In Performance Today, we're told the live and the mediated have collapsed into each other. And Lennon really becomes, as a Beatle, a performing and a performance artist. Life as art. He says, interestingly, we live in a world where we have to hide to make love, while violence is practiced in broad daylight. And credit to Lennon for all his violent inner demons. He does try and channel those towards peaceful means. What does he come out with, however? He comes out with Unfinished Music #1 in 1968, Two Virgins, in which he and Yoko experiment with various sounds and produce an album cover that, of course, is promptly covered in a brown paper bag, as Lennon epitomises both the naive idealism of the hippie movement with a kind of radical politics. And I think it's quite an interesting personification. The Beatles had thought he'd just gone mad. Unfinished Music #2, Life with the Lions, is a little more musical. That comes out the next year. And Lennon had planned to produce an album a year, basically just as a kind of personal diary entry, although that does collapse. He does come out with a wedding album, however, one side of which is John saying Yoko and Yoko replying John. That does get a bit tedious after the first exchange, but this is the kind of situationist art, if you like, or at least very 60s-based avant-garde that Lennon is now into, because he regards himself as an artist. And, of course, the famous Baggism and the peace campaigns are similar. As kind of performance art, the planting of acorns and the hairpiece, bedpiece movement. Lennon himself does not take himself too seriously. He says we're the cosmic jokers. But by 72, and he's ensconced in America with the radical left, he is taking himself seriously, and he comes out with Sometime in New York City, an album mostly written by Yoko, of quite dismissive radical chic, really. He's bought into the radicalism he was previously denying. And when he did declare to the British people we were all guilty of genocide in Ireland, let's just say he lost a few fans. So, but let's not end on that dark note, because out of the White Album, for all its fragmentation, the Beatles at the time were falling apart. Ringo actually left. He was so fed up of the tensions in the studio. Out of that fragmentation does come, as Tony Palmer says, the Beyer tapestry of pop music. And there is something there for everybody. Perhaps there always was on every Beatle album. But whatever your taste in popular music, you will find a track on the White Album that encapsulates that celebrates that satirises that. And I think where the Beatles come through, where much perhaps of the politics of the 60s has failed us, is that there is, with the celebratory and with the ideals, there is a satiric and darker edge, which I guess fits our times too. But we're going to end with a song from George, whom I haven't spoken enough about really this evening. But this is an acoustic version, the first demo version of While My Guitar Gently Weeps. It has an extra verse you won't hear on the Eric Clapton heavy version that was released on the White Album, which talks about watching the stage of life from the wings. I think it's quite beautiful, and I'm using it really as a synoptic collage myself, Richard Hamilton-like, to bring together some of these, to give images to some of the themes that we've discussed tonight. So here is While My Guitar Gently Weeps.